Section 4, Networking Services. In this section, we want to talk about connectivity options and understand some of the basic networking services available with AWS. We'll go ahead and discuss what a virtual private cloud is, how the elastic load balancer works, and also understand what a security group is and why they're so important. We'll also discuss how Cloudfront works and why that's a great service to consider. And then lastly, we'll wrap it up with the connection whiteboard to understand how connectivity to AWS could work. Let's go ahead and proceed on to the remaining part of the section and learn more about these networking services. Network services. In this part of the course, let's talk about what are the basic network services we want to cover for this course, and then I'll talk about some of the additional network services available with AWS. When it comes to AWS, some of the major services that you're going to use pretty much day to day will be everything from Route 53 to Cloudfront, Virtual Private Cloud, and even Cloud Interconnect. When it comes to understanding these services, we'll talk about each of these individually, but basically Route 53 is a DNS service that is meant to allow users to route to internet applications via their DNS service. Then we have Cloudfront. Cloudfront is a content delivery service, caching service that is available with AWS. And then we have VPC. So this is the Amazon's virtual private cloud. This is probably the most basic service that you really need to get to learn with AWS from a networking perspective. Generally, this is to define and basically provision what is called a logically isolated network for your AWS services. Basically a sandbox. This allows you as a customer to create basically your own network. And basically that's really what it is. And this network is isolated from the rest of AWS. Very simple service to deploy, but there is, of course, a lot of complexities with it. We're going to talk about the main areas in this course. And then we have Cloud Interconnect. Now, Cloud Interconnect is a service that a lot of enterprises use basically to connect directly to AWS. Now, Direct Connect is going to allow you as an enterprise to establish what is a private and dedicated connection between your data center to AWS. And this is done typically through third-party providers. So really great capability that is available with AWS. Now, when it comes to other services, there's, of course, a lot of other services that we'd like to cover in this introductory course, but we just don't have time. So I'll run through a basic overview of what they are so that you understand. And for those interested in taking the more advanced AWS courses, we go into all of these in much detail with lots of great demos as well. Now, the Cloud WAF, this is the Web Application Firewall. This is really meant to protect your web apps from your typical web exploits. Everything from having DDoS attacks to CSS script issues, you name it. This is a service that, again, can mitigate issues with your e-commerce sites, for example. And then we have Cloud Shield. Now, Cloud Shield is really specifically to protect against DDoS attacks. So this is a little bit different from WAF, but it has some overlap. But the reality is this is more of a targeted service, mainly to prevent DDoS attacks. Direct Connect, again, that is really meant to connect directly from your on-prem to AWS via private, well-provisioned network. Now, Transit Gateway. Transit Gateway is a service that allows you to connect your VPCs and your on-prem networks through basically what is a hub. This is, again, a connection strategy that can make a lot of sense for enterprises that are well distributed and well managed. Now, VPN, AWS does have VPN related services. So for example, we have basically in AWS, there's really two types of VPNs. We have a VPN client where you could use to connect basically to AWS or on-prem with the VPN. Or we have a site-to-site. This is really meant to connect basically between your Amazon VPCs or your transit gateways. Basically, is the user going to connect, or is this more or less to connect your sites? Then we have App Mesh. This is a really awesome service for developers, I think. It's really meant for microservices architectures. This is application level networking, basically. So we're talking really layer 7 capabilities. And then we have Amazon API Gateway. This is really meant for your development teams to scale your APIs in the cloud and allow your development teams to maintain and secure these APIs. So some really great services, but let's focus on the main 4 for this course. So let's go ahead and move on and talk about our next subject. In this demo, let's go ahead and talk about a virtual private cloud. Now, we're going to go ahead and select VPC there. And what we want to do is go over to where it says VPCs, just to validate the number of VPCs that we have. And I have 1, as you could see. Now, let's go back to the main dashboard. And I just simply select that as well. Before we create a VPC, what we want to just understand is just realize this is really the main area for configuring network-related options for the virtual private cloud. Now, the virtual private cloud, for example, as you're aware, is a provisioned, logical, isolated environment that you're deploying on AWS that is going to allow you to have your own CEDAR range to deploy your networking configs, for example, over here, your subnets, your internet gateways. You could also set up elastic IPs, for example. These are basically going to be the external IPs that you might want to use to have your applications access from outside of AWS. Also NAT gateways, etc. Again, a lot here to talk about. Now, when it comes to VPCs, again, we could go ahead and select subnets over here as well. And this will bring us over to the subnet section. We could always go over here and create a new subnet if we want. And then we could set up our routes. We just create a route table. And then set up our gateways here as well. And then we could have egress only gateways. This is actually a nice feature because when we set up a gateway, it's only going to leave the cloud. The traffic will not be able to get back into the cloud. And this can be really useful for applications that you want to add that layer of security to. Then we have other features and functions we could add over here. For example, here, ACLs, we could set up network ACLs. This is where we would configure our security groups. Basically, a security group, I'll cover that separately because it's a subject in itself. But basically, just realize that is a firewall rule we could create. And then over here, we go down and create gateways for our VPN. We could go ahead and create a customer gateway. Now, a customer gateway, when we select that, we would just go ahead and specify the IP, any kind of certificates, and then create a customer gateway. This is basically going to allow, for example, you or your team or even a partner or a customer access to your cloud resources. And that is one thing we could do. Then over here, We have traffic mirroring we could use. This is great for troubleshooting. And then let's just talk about transit gateways. So a transit gateway, when we select that, is again going to allow us to set up a specific gateway. Now, what's a gateway? Basically, this is going to go basically from the cloud to an on-prem environment, for example. And then we could have client VPN endpoints as well. And we could have a site-to-site VPN as well. As you can see, there's a lot here in the VPC dashboard. Now, this demo, what I'd like to do is launch the VPC wizard. Now, the VPC wizard is really going to walk you through the 4 major steps to deploy your VPC. Now, a VPC, as it shows here, is going to be a private, isolated environment in AWS. We're going to have our subnetting ready to go, our gateways, our security groups. This is really what it's meant. Now, the benefits of a VPC, for example, will provide additional layers of security. And again, some of those could be ACLs, security groups, etc. Now, another thing too to think about is we could have whatever number of VPCs we want. For example, we may want to have a separate VPC to segment traffic from Europe and the United States. And why would we want to do that? Could be for compliance reasons, for example, whatever that rationale is. Over here, what we want to do is go select. We're going to go ahead and enter a Cedar block. I'll leave it as a default for the purposes of this exercise. And you can see here, no IPv6. If you want to use IPv6, you're welcome to do it. Go ahead and put in the name. I'm going to put in AWS test VPC. I'm going to select an availability zone for this, 2A. This will be the public subnet in this case. You could also add an endpoint as well. Now, the endpoints, again, I could select DynamoDB or S3, for example, at this time. I'm not actually going to select one at this time. I don't need it, but I just want to show that to you. And then over here, I could enable host names as well. Now, hardware tenancy. Well, here is one thing to be cognizant of. If I need to have dedicated hardware in any case, I need to select dedicated. And be aware that the cost for this is going to be somewhat different than if you use the shared tenancy. So just be aware of that. Then I go here to create the VPC. Now it's been created. What we want to do is just go back to the dashboard. You can see that there's 2 there. And this is the AWS test VPC. Now, when I scroll over here, for example, you can see that it gives me the ACL link, gives me the idea or actually the information if it's the default VPC or not. Now, I do want to clarify too. By default, Amazon deploys a default VPC for you. That is so that you could launch your resources without having to get your networking stood up immediately. So this is basically what it's for. Now, when I select this VPC, down the bottom, and I'll raise that up a bit for you to see, you can see the description is here. If there's any kind of special config like IPv6, a CEDAR range, that's listed here. Now, flow logs are not enabled by default. You have to create them. Now, the flow logs are really great for determining application issues. For example, it'll capture that IP traffic and give you an idea of what's going on. And then tags. And again, you could always add a tag and number of them that you want. And the value that I set was the AWS test VPC. That is really the VPC at a default level. Now, what I could do here is go over here to actions. I could also add, for example, additional
CEDAR ranges, delete VPC as well. Again, a lot of the same that we saw earlier. Now let's go and talk about a few other things. In another demo, I'm going to go through security groups, but I'll skip over that. ACLs, for example. So network ACL, these are listed here. Now, why do we want a network ACL? And that's a good question because there's some confusion between that. So we want to think about, for example, a security group as a firewall for specific EC2 instances that'll control, and let me show you this as well over here. For example, security groups, this will control, for example, inbound and outbound rules. Over here in network ACLs, for example, when I select that, that has inbound and outbound rules as well, but the main difference here is that the ACLs will be a firewall for the affiliated subnets. So you can see here it has 3 subnets, whereas the security group is only meant for the EC2 instances. Now, there is, of course, reasons to deploy either or, and it's really up to you on how you want to deploy it from a network security perspective. But generally, that is the difference. Let's go ahead and move on to the next module. Elastic Load Balancer. Let's talk about the options available with the Elastic Load Balancer in AWS. Now, when it comes to use cases for Load Balancer, there could be any number of great reasons to want to use it. Generally, we're going to want to use it for network traffic issues, for dealing with scalability, enabling fault tolerance. So if a region goes down or a zone goes down that we're using, we have some fault tolerance built in. You could also deploy this as a single zone or multiple zone deployment. The Elastic Load Balancer in AWS, there's 3 types. There's a classic load balancer, an application load balancer, and the network load balancer. So let's talk about these. The classic load balancer is really meant for your internal AWS only traffic. It's really meant to do very simple, straightforward load balancing across multiple instances. It's not meant to handle multiple services or anything like that. But generally, most customers are going to be using either network or application load balancing. Now, the application load balancer is layer 7 generally. So that's going to be our application-based services. So if we're using like microservices, containers, e-commerce sites, we're probably going to be using the application load balancer. The network load balancer is really meant to handle layer 4 traffic, such as our UDP, our transport layer connections. It's really meant, again, for layer 4 connectivity. So it works at a lower level of the stack. When it comes to deploying the load balancer, we could deploy this in any number of ways. We could deploy it in a simple setup or a more complex setup. We could also deploy this in our application deployments. Basically, we could deploy network load balancer and the application load balancer as well. And again, it just depends how we're going to deploy and what type of application we're deploying. So we could go ahead and deploy basically our internal load balancing with the application load balancer, layer 7, and then our network load balancer is going to be layer 4. And we would set up what's called basically target groups or instance groups is another way to set up our EC2 instances, and basically allows us to direct traffic as needed. The load balancer, for example, from a feature perspective, is pretty robust and is comparable to other cloud providers. We have high availability, health checks, security features, TLS termination, layer 4, layer 7, monitoring capabilities. For example, if I need to monitor my load balancer, I could do that. I could set up CloudWatch. I could also, of course, set up TLS termination for my apps so that there's no hang-ups or basically issues around connectivity. I could just terminate that based on a specific timeout if I want. Also, too, health checks is always something we want to consider. This is going to monitor is that load balancer available. It's going to check every 60 seconds as needed. Now, there is, of course, as a review here, we know that there's 3 types of load balancers. One thing that the ELB does do is that it does report, but it's only going to report when there's a request. ELB will also measure and send metrics in 60-second intervals, basically. So that's one thing to be aware of as well. Now, when it comes to monitoring, there's a lot more that goes into this, but for the purposes of this course, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next subject and learn more about other network services. So let's go ahead and proceed.
Okay, let's talk about security groups. Now, in the previous modules, I had covered basically what a VPC is, and I talked about some of these other functions as well. The main thing I want to now talk about is security groups, because this is a critical task that you almost always need to set up for your EC2 instances. And because of this, there's typically a little bit of confusion. Now, if we think about it, if we have a firewall and we want to have, for example, specific traffic like SSH or HTTPS or RDP go through to the virtual machine in the cloud or even on-prem, we need to have firewall rules set up. And in the world of AWS, we would call that a security group. Now, you can see here I have different security groups here. When I select the default, for example, this is the description and gives you some brief information of the default security group. Then I go to inbound. You can see that by default, it's letting all traffic in. Now, generally, we don't want to allow that. However, to get around that, what we want to do is to create a new security group and basically do this for every EC2 instance to make sure only traffic that is needed goes to the appropriate EC2 instance. This is inbound, and then outbound, as you can see here. And then we could add tags. Okay, what we want to do now is create a security group. And this security group name, I'm going to call this sec group AWS course. Now, the description, I'm going to say this is a demo. And then what I want to do is select the VPC that I created, which is the AWS test VPC. And then I just simply go create. So I just created a security group. Now, I created the security group, however, I still need to do what? I need to go over here and I need to configure the inbound rules, the outbound rules, etc. Let me expand that there. Now, the inbound rules, you can see that there are no rules that have been approved yet or actually edited for. I'm going to go to Edit Rules. And the first thing that I want to do is add a rule. I want to add, in this case, SSH. And that's port 22. And here I could go and select my IP. Now, this will give you the IP address of where you are accessing AWS from. Or I could go anywhere or custom. Now, generally, if you're in a corporate enterprise and you have administrators logging in from different locations or developers, select custom and make sure that you have the appropriate CEDAR range that they're coming from. And to do that, what we generally want to do is set up some kind of a bastion host where the access is going to come from. And that's one rule. Let's go ahead and add another rule. And in this case, let's go ahead and type in, not RDP, but let's put in HTTP. Let's see here. There it is.
and I'll just select HTTP, let's say. Let's say I'm going to deploy a WordPress on this. I would have one rule for HTTP, and then I would do the same. So because it's like going to be a WordPress site, let's say, I'm going to just leave it at anywhere. In other words, they can get to the website without a problem with HTTP. Then I want to do the same, for example, with HTTPS. And again, that is, again, one way we could control access, add firewall rules, and basically ensure that the right traffic is allowed in from the right location. And then I could also add, for example, to this security group, additional rules. So a custom TCP rule. For example, maybe I don't want to have DNS queries, for example, just coming from anywhere, and maybe I just want to allow myself just being, just the ability to run DNS queries, for example. And then I just save the rule. And then bingo, that rule is now, as you see, fully configured. And then basically the outbound rule will allow all traffic. Now, we generally don't want to allow all traffic by default in a lot of cases, because it could be that what can happen is someone can hijack the EC2 instance, start sending out information. Could be an insider that might be sending out log files or capturing information somehow on transactions, and could actually send it out to the cloud, for example. So these are just some of the things that we want to pay attention to. That is really simply how a security group would be configured. And then this is the security group AWS. So what we want to do now is I need to go over here to EC2. There's 3 running instances. What I'd like to do now, you can see that I have a demo instance. When I select that, I have the ability now, for example, to go to actions. And then basically, if I want, I could stop that instance and then basically update it as well. Or if I'm configuring a new instance, I would go over here to select. And over here, you can see network. This is where I would select my network, my subnet as well. Go down here, add storage. I could add tags as well. So let's go back here as well. You can see there I could select the subnet that I want to use, whatever that is. Network. This is the test VPC that I want to use, and tie it to that VPC I just created. And remember that VPC has what? That security group that's been basically tied to that. And then down here I have, if I scroll down here, this is my network interfaces. I could also, again, if I had additional devices set up, I could go ahead and enable that as well. With that said, there's a lot here that you can do. Then you go to add tags. Then over here, what I could do is basically select an existing security group that I created. And remember, I selected the VPC that had that security group in it. And then what I could do as well, and remember, the VPCs can have security groups, but we also want security groups on the instance itself. And there's a whiteboard that I'm going through coming up at the end of the network section. I'm going to put this all together for you, so just be aware. So it is a little confusing at first because there's multiple layers of firewall rules, which are what? Security groups in AWS. So I'm going to go ahead and select this one here. And that's been selected. So you can see there that I have these rules now populated. And then I go review and launch. Then I need to choose the key pair. Actually, just go ahead and choose the existing one and then launch it. And that'll deploy that EC2 instance with those security groups. Remember, one for the VPC and one for the EC2 instance. Let's go ahead and move on to the next module. AWS Cloudfront. Let's talk about content delivery options with AWS and specifically around CloudFront. CloudFront is a fast content delivery network. It's a worldwide network that was built specifically for AWS-based services and solutions. It is meant, of course, to provide an edge-level solution for content delivery. So if you're using, for example, solutions such as Akamai, similar to that approach. So CloudFront supports, of course, pretty much any AWS app that you'd want it to support. It supports S3, EC2, load balancing, DNS, and also other services such as media services and Lambda. Now, AWS CloudFront is a distributed network. It has, at the time of writing the course, 205 edge locations. You could see on the dots all the blue dots and purple dots. You could see there's regional edges and then edge locations as well. It's available in 42 countries and 84 cities as well at the time of writing. Lastly, when it comes to CloudFronts, it's important to know that the use case for CloudFront is generally to provide a better user experience. One of the challenges with content delivery is that our user base might be very well used to having applications that are, of course, high performing and low latency. When it comes to CloudFront, this can provide you that same capability. So if you're using CloudFront, then the goal is to, of course, not only reduce costs for your content delivery, but also increase the performance by providing this content at the edge. Now, it has, of course, features and functions that can enable faster delivery. One important note, though, is from a cost perspective, there's no cost for placing data into CloudFront. It's just the charges, of course, going out of CloudFront. Now, of course, when it comes to content delivery, there's 1,000 things to consider, when it comes to where is our user base and what is the application pattern and behavior that we have to understand. Are they going to be dropping files into our application, or are they pulling them out? A lot of things are going to have to come into play with making the right decision for content delivery. And CloudFront is an excellent option with AWS. Let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the course. In this whiteboard, what I'd like to do is talk about connection strategies to AWS. Now, in this session, what we have is basically a AWS cloud deployment with an on-prem deployment, and let's say we have a competitor cloud as well. Now, what we want to do in this case, for example, we want to go ahead and make sure that we could connect from on-prem to AWS. Now, there is certainly more than a few things to think about, but basically what we could do first is after we have, for example, set up a virtual private cloud, let's just say this is one here, and then I have another VPC here, and I'll go ahead and mark this so we could see VPC 1 and then VPC 2. And remember, virtual private cloud is going to be a segmentation of cloud resources, basically. With that said, let's say we have developers on-prem, and then in this case here, we also might have cloud, or let's just say internet users as well, that want to access the resources. What we could do here is basically allow users to access, for example, the resources from on-prem, and let me get that right there. And we could have, for example, two separate connections, two VPN connections to the two different VPCs. Now, we could also use another service, for example, that would be called AWS Direct Connect. Now, Direct Connect is a low latency connection directly from your on-prem site to AWS. Now, basically AWS Direct Connect is going to allow you to connect to one or more VPCs. And what's nice about Direct Connect is that you can, for example, let me get a different color, connect here, and then you could also connect here over the same link. Now with Direct Connect, we would want to have a Direct Connect gateway. And what we would do is basically set up a gateway here that would allow us to connect to both VPCs. And as part of this, we would have what's called a private virtual interface as well, so that when we connect from on-prem, we're going to basically the gateway here and connecting to either this VPC or this VPC. Doesn't have to be in the same region. It could be in different regions. It doesn't matter. The gateway will go ahead and route this cross-region if needed. Now, there will be, of course, possibly when we use cross-region, there could be additional costs for bandwidth and stuff, but just be aware that, as an enterprise might not be that concerned with it if that's meeting their requirements, especially if you want a cross-region basis. With that said, we want to be able to aggregate our connections, and Direct Connect is a great way to do that. Now, if we didn't want to use Direct Connect, what we need to do is basically, and I'll draw a different color here, is set up here a VPN connection, and again, another connection to here. And we really wouldn't want to use the same VPN connection. Remember, too, the VPN connection is going to be tied to that VPC, for example. So we need to pay attention to how we would set up our environment. Now, there is also a managed VPN service. What we could do as well is with the VPN, for example, here, set up a gateway as well. And that would allow us to access, for example, different availability zones. That's an additional cost. A lot of customers may not want to have the managed VPN. They may want to use, for example, a software VPN or transit VPC is another option. I just wanted to sort of cover a couple scenarios here to give you an idea of how you might connect from on-prem. Let's go ahead and move on to the next module.